It's very rare that a miracle is captured on film or video, but we've discovered one. It happened halfway around the world in Adelaide, Australia. A young boy playing on the bank of a river is suddenly swept into its raging waters. What happened next might be described as divine intervention caught on tape.
Roger, 101, Stir Creek, young lad's fallen in.
It was mid-afternoon when the distress call reached Constable John Potter.
The original call was of the lad that was being swept down towards the bridge on Morfett Road. A patrol that had already responded to the scene said that the child had already passed under the bridge.
Potter and his partner immediately turned their vehicle around and headed for the nearest access point to the river, hoping to spot the young boy.
When I first arrived at the scene area, I actually took my gun belt off and threw it in the car, and then went over the fence and stood on the top of the creek itself.
Moments after Constable Potter reached the river's edge, the figure of a small and terrified child drifted into view.
When I first saw Chris, he was out in the middle of the creek, just maintaining his head above the water. He looked quite terrified. He was obviously cold and he was scared. Just as he was coming to me, I dived in, thinking that, as I dived, I'd be able to catch him.
But he underestimated the speed of the river's current and ended up ahead of the child.
So I really had to work hard, dig the heels into the concrete floor of the creek and everything else to slow myself up enough that Chris was swept towards me and I could actually grab hold of him and support him.
With the frigid waters flowing at an estimated 20 miles per hour, all that Potter could do was to help Chris keep his head above water and pray that the other officers racing to the scene would arrive in time. Constable John Baldwin was not far from the river when he heard the report of a child in danger. Using his knowledge of the area, Constable Baldwin quickly headed downstream to try to position himself to intercept the child, not knowing that a fellow member of his unit was also trapped in the raging river.
As I arrived at the scene on Pine Avenue, I parked my vehicle. I heard at that stage as I was getting out of the vehicle that there was a member in the water with the child. So I ran about 300 metres, I would imagine, south. And that location, I saw John Potter and the child in the water. He was holding the child. I yelled out to John, and when he got closer, I could see his face, and I thought, oh, this is a pretty serious sort of a matter we've got here. And the child was absolutely petrified.
John Baldwin was actually on the side of the bank, right down at the water level. And I threw Chris to him, hoping that he'd be able to grab hold of Chris and take him out of the water.
I reached out, went to grab the child. Consequently, my footing gave way, and John had flowed downstream. The child was by himself, so I jumped out towards the child.
There were now 3 people caught in the river's current, separated by a great distance and being swept along helplessly by the sheer force of its powerful waters.
The lad at that particular stage had caught up to John. John had the lad in his possession. I remember another police officer, Scott Merritt, as we passed under a bridge, he was attached to a harness type of thing. He went to grab the child.
Grab the kid! Grab the right!
He had hold of the child for a split second or so, buffeted him up, and he cracked himself against the concrete. And of course, that stage, the child was again free.
Just around the curve, a trash rack was holding back debris in the middle of the river.
As that came up, I made my way towards that and actually grabbed hold of the side of the trash rack and managed to stand up alongside the trash rack. And then as Chris came down, I actually grabbed him by the arm.
John grabbed his arm. He then grabbed John's pants. I came down behind him, hit the trash rack, held onto it for dear life, pushed the lad up a bit onto John's back. At that point, he was white in colour. He was exhausted, absolutely exhausted.
Miraculously, all 3 victims managed to hold on to the trash rack and stop their rapid descent down the river. But their ordeal was far from over.
The young lad, Chris, was saying, are we going to die? Are we going to get out of this? Oh, different other things, but basically he was really scared that he was going to die.
At that moment, another officer, Constable David O'Donovan, arrived on the scene.
It seemed very serious at the time. There was a large amount of public around. There were quite a number of police officers running up and down the creek. There was a reasonable amount of confusion and a lot of talk on the radio. As soon as we arrived there, I grabbed several ropes and we moved to the area of the creek and making a quick assessment of what was happening, and we began the rescue.
What we're going to do...
His partner, Constable Les Buckley, would coordinate the rescue.
And we're going to swing across. Yeah.
I was concerned that they'd been in the water for a period of time. They appeared to be suffering from the effects of the water, and I was concerned that they may possibly lose their grip and get washed down the river.
More than 30 minutes had passed since Chris and his rescuers had fallen into the freezing waters, and a 4th man was about to join them.
I entered the water up the creek from where they were sitting on the trash rack, and basically just the flow of the water carried me to the rack, and of course my first concern was to get the child off the trash rack to safety.
Just prior to getting to the trash rack, we actually locked him off to make sure that we could actually hold him, because I was concerned that he may go into the mouth of the trash rack, which would have meant that he may have been washed under the water. That caused him to be submerged for a little while, which I apologise for.
Dave managed to stand up and used the ropes that he'd brought with him to actually attach Chris to his harness.
And having taken hold of the boy, I called to the guys on the line that I was going to let go of the trash rack, and basically the natural movement of the water and with the position of the line, I was dragged across to the embankment and carried the boy across to the side.
Chris was exhausted and hypothermic after spending over 45 minutes in the freezing waters, and yet even in this condition it was apparent that his rescue had been truly miraculous. Chris was finally safe on shore, but there were still 2 other lives in danger. First to come off the trash rack was John Baldwin, followed shortly by John Potter.
Any of the guys that I worked with would have done the same thing had they been in the same position. But just that I was the first one on the scene, so I was the first one in the water.
Feeling better?
The next day, John Potter met Chris at the hospital where he was being treated for hypothermia.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you, mate.
And the young boy gave his rescuer a gift, a bag of lifesavers. It was also an opportunity for Chris's mother, Donna Butler, to personally thank John for his part in a miracle.
I really wanted to give him my heartfelt thanks, and he was like, oh, it's nothing, I said, you're a pretty special guy, and he goes, no, I'm not. And I said, well, I think you are.
No worries. Thank you very much. Okay. I'd say thank you very much. Thank you for saving my life.
We got it all right, didn't we? Beautiful.